Madness is rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, and ages, it is the rule. This line, drawn from Friedrich Nietzsche, opens a disturbing window into one of the oldest and most uncomfortable truths about human beings. That reason, which seems so solid when we are alone, tends to dissolve the moment we become part of a crowd. These words are not simply an observation about mobs or riots. They are a warning about something quieter and far more common. The invisible pressure that shapes opinions, choices, and even moral judgments whenever the self is folded into the mass. Nietzsche, who spent much of his philosophy attacking the comfort of the herd, saw in this collapse of individual reason something almost biological. Man, when alone, weighs evidence, hesitates, doubts. Man, inside a group, borrows the certainty of those around him and mistakes that borrowed certainty for his own conviction. What Nietzsche is pointing toward here is what we might call the threshold of surrender, the moment where a person quietly stops thinking for himself and starts thinking through the group instead. The larger the crowd, the smaller the individual becomes within it. This shrinking is not only physical or social. It happens inside the mind itself. A person who would never shout an insult alone finds himself shouting it inside a stadium. A person who would carefully examine a claim before believing it accepts the same claim instantly once enough others around him seem to believe it too. Psychologists call this diffusion of responsibility, but the older, simpler name for it is the loss of the self inside the herd. It is as if the individual, upon entering the crowd, sheds a layer of himself at the door. What remains is a stripped-down version, more emotional, more suggestible, more willing to act on impulse than on judgment. This is the psychological maze Gustave Le Bon described in his 1895 study of crowd behavior, a maze in which the individual descends several rungs on the ladder of civilization the moment he becomes absorbed into a mass of people. Le Bon argued that inside the crowd, a person does not simply agree with others. He becomes someone else entirely, someone with a different, more primitive nervous system, governed less by conscious reasoning and more by contagion, suggestion, and unconscious impulse. Ideas do not spread through crowds by argument. They spread the way a fever spreads, through proximity, repetition, and emotional heat. This raises a deep inner conflict that every person eventually meets, whether he recognizes it or not. The conflict between the desire to belong and the responsibility to think independently. To belong is safety. To think independently is exposure. And exposure, in evolutionary terms, has always been dangerous. The herd offers protection precisely because it erases difference, and it punishes whoever insists on remaining different. Sigmund Freud approached this same territory from another angle in his work on group psychology, arguing that when individuals merge into a crowd, something like a collective mind takes over, a shared emotional current that overrides personal judgment. Freud saw the leader of a group as a kind of substitute for the individual conscience. Once a crowd finds a figure to follow, its members quietly hand over their own moral evaluation to that figure and act with a unity of feeling they would never reach alone. On the existential level, this labyrinth becomes even more unsettling. The individual's crisis is not only that the crowd pressures him to conform, but that it removes the very awareness that he is conforming. A person inside the herd rarely feels that he has surrendered anything. He feels, instead, that he has finally found agreement, warmth, belonging, even as his independent judgment quietly disappears beneath the surface. A person who tries to resist this pull, who insists on evaluating evidence for himself, even while everyone around him has already decided, finds himself in a strange and uncomfortable position. The crowd does not usually attack such a person with open hostility at first. It does something subtler. It simply stops listening to him, treats his hesitation as arrogance, and slowly pushes him toward the edges of the group. He is in a position where he tries to hold on to independent thought while the social current pulls in the opposite direction. This existential isolation of the dissenter is embodied in the difference between the herd's need for unity and the individual's need for truth. The more a person insists on examining claims rather than absorbing them, the more he distances himself from the emotional rhythm of the group around him, because careful thought and collective excitement rarely move at the same speed. This person remains in a constant internal tension between his loyalty to what he can verify and his desire to remain part of the group that surrounds him. And instead of belonging becoming a source of comfort, it becomes, for this person, a quiet performance, a mask worn to avoid the cost of visible difference. This tension between conformity and inner honesty is evident in works such as Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, where a town physician who discovers a public health danger is turned, almost overnight, from a respected citizen into an outcast, simply because his discovery threatens the comfortable consensus of his neighbors. In the play, the crowd does not evaluate his evidence. It evaluates only how inconvenient his evidence is. When the physician insists on the truth despite the cost, he discovers that he has separated himself from a community that cannot tolerate a fact strong enough to disturb its unity. This existential separation is evident in his own words to his family, as he realizes, painfully, that the strongest man is the one who stands most alone. This separation is not merely a disagreement with his neighbors. It is a collision with the deeper psychological need of any group to protect its shared story about itself, even at the expense of the truth. This situation is not unique to a Norwegian play from the 19th century. It is a reflection of a condition that repeats itself wherever a person notices something the group around him refuses to notice or refuses to admit. The scientist who publishes inconvenient data, the employee who raises the one objection nobody wants to hear in a meeting, the witness who refuses to repeat a story simply because everyone else in the room already believes it. Each of these finds himself standing in the same narrow corridor of the labyrinth, where independent perception collides with collective comfort. This isolation is not simply social. It is, more precisely, a kind of perceptual isolation, the strange experience of seeing something plainly while surrounded by people who, for reasons that have little to do with intelligence, cannot or will not see it. Solomon Asch demonstrated this with unsettling clarity in his classic conformity experiments, in which test subjects, faced with a group of actors giving an obviously wrong answer to a simple visual question, frequently abandon the evidence of their own eyes rather than stand apart from the group's incorrect consensus. What Asch's experiments reveal is not that people are stupid, but that the pull of the herd operates beneath the level of conscious reasoning. Many of his subjects did not even feel that they were lying when they gave the group's wrong answer. Some genuinely began to doubt what they had seen. This is the deepest and most disturbing corridor of the labyrinth, the point where the herd does not merely pressure behavior, but begins to reshape perception itself. Carl Jung offers another route into this same maze through his concept of participation mystique, a state in which the boundary between the individual psyche and the collective psyche becomes blurred, and a person begins to feel, think, and react less as a distinct self and more as an extension of the group's mood. Jung warned that modern man, who believes himself far too rational to be swept up by primitive collective forces, is in fact just as vulnerable to them as any member of an ancient tribal ritual. The forces have simply changed costume, dressing themselves now in the language of political movements, market panics, or online outrage instead of drums and masks. The individual who wishes to resist this pull faces a paradox that has troubled thinkers since antiquity. The same social instincts that make cooperation, trust, and civilization possible are the very instincts that make her behavior so dangerous. We cannot simply delete the part of ourselves that seeks belonging without also damaging our capacity for empathy, cooperation, and love. The labyrinth of herd psychology, in other words, is not an external trap we can avoid by staying away from crowds. It runs through the architecture of the human mind itself. Søren Kierkegaard captured this paradox sharply when he argued that the crowd, as such, is untruth. Not because the individuals within it are dishonest, but because the crowd as a structure dissolves personal responsibility into an anonymous mass where no one, in the end, feels fully accountable for what the group as a whole has done. 100 people can participate in a cruelty that not one of them would commit alone, precisely because each can quietly tell himself that he was only following, only present, only one voice among many. Elias Canetti, in his study of crowds and power, pushed this even further, describing how a crowd seeks not merely agreement, but a kind of dissolving of individual boundaries altogether, a temporary release from the isolation and fear that come with being a separate self. For Canetti, the appeal of the crowd is almost physical. Inside it, the fear of being touched, judged, or singled out disappears, replaced by the intoxicating sensation of being merely a cell within something larger than oneself. This is where the moral weight of the labyrinth becomes most visible. If belonging to the crowd offers relief from the loneliness of being an individual, what responsibility does a person still carry for what the crowd does in his name? Hannah Arendt confronted exactly this question in her account of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, where she was struck not by monstrous hatred, but by something far more ordinary, a bureaucratic, thoughtless conformity to the structures and language surrounding him. Arendt's phrase for this, the banality of evil, remains one of the most uncomfortable insights into herd psychology ever written. That catastrophic collective harm rarely requires a monster at its center. It often requires only a great many people who have quietly stopped thinking for themselves. Stanley Milgram's later experiments on obedience to authority extended this insight into the laboratory, showing that ordinary people, placed under the mild social pressure of a calm authority figure and the diffuse presence of an experimental team, would administer what they believed were painful and even dangerous electric shocks to a stranger, simply because refusing felt more socially costly than complying. Milgram was not studying cruelty. He was studying the astonishing willingness of individuals to hand their own moral judgment over to a structure, whether that structure is a person in a lab coat or the unspoken consensus of everyone else in the room. On the moral level, then, the labyrinth of herd psychology raises a question that each person eventually has to answer for himself. Is conformity simply the price of living inside a society, an acceptable and even necessary softening of individual will for the sake of cooperation? Or is it a slow erosion of the very faculty that makes a person morally responsible for his own actions? Rousseau, writing about the tension between the individual will and what he called the general will, believed that a healthy society requires the individual to internalize collective values without losing his own judgment entirely, a delicate balance that in practice, herd psychology makes extraordinarily difficult to maintain. The literature of the 20th century returned to this labyrinth again and again, often through the image of a single dissenting voice inside an unquestioning crowd. George Orwell's fictional visions of totalitarian conformity, Arthur Miller's portrait of mass hysteria in a small town gripped by accusation and fear, and countless quieter, less dramatic stories of ordinary workplaces and neighborhoods, all circle the same discovery, that the crowd does not need force to control a person. It only needs to make disagreement feel like betrayal. And yet, the labyrinth is not without an exit, even if that exit is narrow and often lonely. The same psychological research that reveals how easily people conform also reveals something quieter but more hopeful, that a single dissenting voice, even one, can dramatically weaken the grip of the crowd on everyone else within it. Ash's own experiments showed that when even one other person in the room gave the correct answer alongside the subject, conformity to the group's error collapsed dramatically. The herd's power, in other words, depends heavily on its appearance of total unanimity. Break that appearance even slightly, and its spell weakens. In conclusion, the psychology of the herd is not a strange or distant phenomenon confined to riots, cults, or history's darkest chapters. It is a current running quietly beneath ordinary life, In meetings, in classrooms, in online debates, in family gatherings. Wherever the comfort of agreement competes with the harder, lonelier discipline of independent thought. To enter this labyrinth honestly is to recognize that the crowd lives, in some measure, inside each of us, waiting for the moment we mistake belonging for truth. Perhaps the deepest lesson of this maze is not that the herd should be feared or entirely rejected, but that it should be recognized. The individual who understands the pull of the crowd, who can feel it operating on his own mind in real time, gains something the fully absorbed crowd member never has: a choice. And in that narrow space of choice, between the warmth of agreement and the cold clarity of one's own judgment, the entire moral weight of what it means to remain a thinking individual finally comes to rest.